Yeah, to Desmond Doss. They believed prayer ends where bullets begin. He prayed and kept moving. The rope smelled like wet hemp and something else. Blood, maybe, or just the mineral tang of the Okinawa mud that clung to everything in April 1945. Private Desmond Doss wrapped it once around his forearm, testing the tension, listening to the groan of the anchor point somewhere up on the lip of Hacksaw Ridge. Below him, in the pre-dawn dimness, stretcher-bearers from the 77th Infantry Division waited with hands already tired. Above him, on top of that sheer cliff face the men simply called the Ridge, someone was screaming for a medic. It was the fourth day of the assault, the fourth day of hauling bodies up a cargo net just to get shot at, the fourth day of mortar fire walking back and forth across the plateau like God's own broom, sweeping men into craters and shell holes. Most of the company had pulled back the night before, rotating off the line, faces blank with exhaustion. But the Japanese positions hadn't pulled back. The bunkers carved into coral stone stayed exactly where they'd been, and the machine guns kept hammering the same beaten zones they'd zeroed in days ago. Doss had come down with the last group. He'd meant to stay down. He'd told himself he'd done enough. But then, just as the sky began to lighten, a runner stumbled into the staging area below the cliff with a message from the platoon sergeant still up top. Wounded, trapped, can't move them. Need Doss. Not need a medic, need Doss. The lieutenant who caught the message looked at Doss with something like pity. The other medics had rotated out. The aid station was already overloaded. And Doss, the one who wouldn't carry a rifle, the one some of the men had called a coward back in training, was the only one who'd proven he could work up there, in that hell, without freezing or breaking. "You don't have to go back up," the lieutenant said quietly. Doss looked at the rope in his hands. He could still hear the screaming, faint and distant, carried on the wind that came over the ridge. "I know," Doss said. But he was already checking his aid bag, already whispering the prayer he'd whispered 100 times before. "Lord, help me get one more. Just one more." He started climbing. The cargo net swayed under his weight, slick with morning dew and the residue of yesterday's rain. His hands found the familiar rhythm, reach, grip, pull, step, and his mind fell into the other rhythm, the one nobody else could hear, prayer as movement. Not kneeling, not stillness. Just the steady repetition of faith spoken into the gaps between breaths, between handholds, between the crack of distant rifle fire. "Thank you for my hands. Thank you for this rope. Help me reach him. Just one more." By the time he crested the ridge, the sun was beginning to burn through the haze, and he could see the whole brutal geography of Hacksaw. The cratered plateau stretching 300 yards to the shattered tree line, the mud churned into a moonscape, the scattered helmets and abandoned gear marking where men had fallen or run. The platoon sergeant met him near the cliff edge, face streaked with dirt and something darker. "Doss, thank God. We got 3 men pinned in a crater, maybe 50 yards out. Can't get to them. Snipers got the whole approach covered." Doss nodded, swallowing against the dryness in his throat. He looked out across the open ground, seeing the route in his mind. Low crawl to the first shell hole, then angle left toward the ridgeline, use the broken stump for cover, then straight across the last 30 yards to the crater. "I'll get them," he said. The sergeant grabbed his shoulder. "Doss, listen. You don't have a weapon. If that sniper sees you, then I'll pray faster." It wasn't a joke. It was the simple truth of how Desmond Doss moved through war. Prayer wasn't something that stopped when the bullets started. Prayer was the movement. Faith wasn't the thing you did in the safe moments. It was the thing that carried you into the moments that weren't safe at all. He dropped to his belly and started crawling, whispering as he moved. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The first man in the crater had taken shrapnel across his back, dozens of small wounds that leaked steadily through his torn uniform. The second had a compound fracture of the femur, the bone visible through the rip in his trousers, his face grey with shock. The third was unconscious, a head wound that Doss couldn't properly assess in the cramped space of the shell hole, with mud up to their knees and the constant crack thump of the sniper's rifle searching for movement. Doss worked in the tiny space, his hands moving through the routines he'd practiced until they became prayer themselves: bandage, tourniquet, morphine, pressure. He spoke quietly to the conscious men, his voice steady even as his hands shook. "You're going to be fine. We'll get you down. Just stay still." One of them, a rifleman from Georgia named Caleb, grabbed Doss's wrist. "How are you going to move us? Sniper's got this whole area locked down." Doss looked back toward the ridge, calculating. The rope was there, hanging over the cliff edge, like a lifeline to another world. But between here and there lay 50 yards of open ground that the sniper had already proven he owned. "One at a time," Doss said. "I'll drag you back on a poncho, low and slow. That'll take hours. You'll be exhausted. Then I'll rest and pray between trips." Caleb stared at him, trying to understand how a man could say something like that without irony, without bravado, just as a simple statement of fact. Back in training, Caleb had been one of the loudest voices calling Doss a coward, mocking his refusal to even touch a rifle during drills. Now lying in the mud with his leg shattered and a sniper hunting for targets, he was looking at the same man and seeing something different. The extraction took 3 hours. Doss made the journey 4 times, once for each wounded man and once to retrieve their weapons and gear, because leaving rifles behind felt wrong even to a man who wouldn't carry one himself. Each trip was a crawl through hell, the weight of a body on the poncho, the sniper's rounds kicking up dirt close enough to taste, the exhaustion that turned his arms to water and made every yard feel like a mile. But between each trip, he stopped, rested, prayed. "Thank you, Lord. One more. Help me get one more." By the time he got all 3 men to the cliff edge, the platoon sergeant was shaking his head in disbelief. The rope system they'd rigged was simple, a harness made of web gear and parachute cord, with a team of men below to catch and lower each casualty. Doss helped secure the first man, checked the knots twice, then watched him disappear over the edge. The second man went down smoothly, but when they rigged the third, the unconscious one with the head wound, the rope started to fray. Doss saw it immediately. A section about 6 feet from the anchor point where the hemp had worn against the rough coral stone, individual fibers splitting and curling away from the main line. The sergeant saw it too. "Jesus, that won't hold another run." Doss knelt beside the rope, examining the damage. They had maybe one more descent before the whole thing gave way. Maybe. The problem was simple. There were more wounded. The battle wasn't over. The ridge wasn't secure. And this rope, this single fraying line of hemp, was the only way to get men down alive. "We need new rope," the sergeant said. "From supply." "How long?" "Could be hours. Could be tomorrow." Doss looked out across the plateau, where the afternoon light was beginning to slant across the cratered ground. Somewhere out there, in the wreckage of the day's fighting, more men were wounded. More voices would call for a medic as darkness fell, and the rope wouldn't last. He made a decision that felt both completely reasonable and utterly insane. "Then we use what we have," he said quietly, "and we pray it holds." The sergeant opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, because what else could they do? Leave men on top of the ridge overnight, with Japanese infiltrators and mortar fire and the simple creeping terror of being trapped above a cliff in the dark? Doss was already checking his aid bag, already preparing to go back out. The rhythm of Hacksaw Ridge became a rhythm of prayer and rope. All through the afternoon and into the early evening of that April day in 1945, Doss moved across the plateau, finding the wounded where they'd fallen or crawled, stabilizing them as best he could, then dragging them back to the cliff edge one by one. Each time he helped secure them to the fraying rope. Each time he whispered a prayer as they went over the edge. And each time he returned to the open ground to search for one more. The rope held, barely. With every descent, more fibers split and curled away from the main line, but the core stayed intact, and the men kept going down alive. Below, At the aid station that had been set up in a ravine 200 yards from the base of the cliff, Captain Morrison watched the steady stream of casualties with growing disbelief. Morrison was a surgeon, 38 years old, who'd seen plenty of heroism in his months with the 77th Infantry Division. But this was different. This was one unarmed man, working alone on top of a ridge that two companies had failed to secure, lowering wounded soldiers on a rope that should have snapped hours ago. "How many has he sent down?" Morrison asked the orderly tracking arrivals. 19 so far, sir, since noon." Morrison shook his head, watching as another body came down the rope, caught by waiting hands and transferred to a stretcher. 19 men who would have died on that ridge. 19 families who might get their sons or husbands back, all because one medic refused to believe that prayer ended where bullets began. Up on the ridge, Doss was learning the limits of his own body. His hands were raw and bleeding, palms torn by rope and rock. His knees were shredded from crawling across broken coral. Dehydration made his head pound and his vision blur at the edges. But the worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion. The worst part was the moral weight, the knowledge that every minute he rested was a minute someone might be bleeding out. Every decision to take a safer route instead of the direct one might mean arriving too late. He found a young private named Chen, trapped under a collapsed dugout, both legs pinned by timber and coral rubble. It took 20 minutes to dig him out, 20 minutes of working with bare hands while rifle fire crackled somewhere to the north, and the light continued to fade. When Doss finally pulled him free and started the long drag back to the rope, Chen kept whispering the same question. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Doss didn't have a good answer. Or rather, he had an answer so simple it sounded insane. "Because you called for help, but you could die." "Yes." "So why?" Doss paused, breathing hard, looking at the darkening sky above the ridge. "Because faith isn't what you do when it's safe," he said finally. "It's what you do when it's not." When they reached the rope, Doss saw immediately that they had a problem. The frayed section had gotten worse, much worse. Whole strands had separated from the core, and the remaining fibers looked ready to part with the next load. The sergeant met his eyes and shook his head. "Doss, we can't, it won't hold." But Chen was gut-shot, bleeding internally, already going into shock. Minutes mattered. Doss looked at the rope, then at Chen, then back at the rope. He did the math that nobody wanted to do. Either they sent Chen down on a rope that might break, or they waited for new rope that might arrive too late. "We have to try," Doss said. They rigged Chen as carefully as they could, spreading the load, adding extra support. Doss stood at the edge, one hand on the rope, feeling it tremble under the weight, and he prayed. Not the usual quick prayer, but a long, desperate plea for strength, for grace, for the rope to hold just one more time. It held. Barely. When Chen reached the bottom and the rope came back up, Doss could see that they were done. The core was exposed now, maybe a dozen fibers left intact, the rest peeled away like bark from a tree. One more descent would snap it for sure. But the ridge wasn't empty. Across the plateau in the gathering darkness, Doss could still hear them calling. Voices in the smoke and shadows. Wounded men who didn't know the rope was finished, who just knew that somewhere out there, the medic who wouldn't quit was still moving, still praying, still coming. Doss closed his eyes and asked God a question he'd never asked before. How many times can a man say just one more before something breaks? The answer came not in words but in a feeling, a quiet certainty that settled in his chest. Until there are no more to save. He went back out. "Until, would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history." Full darkness brought a different kind of terror to Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese were expert at night infiltration, and the coral caves and bunkers that honeycombed the plateau gave them dozens of routes to move unseen. The platoon had pulled back into a tight defensive perimeter near the cliff edge, leaving the rest of the ridge to the darkness and whatever moved within it. Standard procedure said you didn't go out there at night. Standard procedure said you dug in, stood watch, and waited for dawn. Desmond Doss had stopped following standard procedure around the time he refused to carry a rifle. He moved through the darkness with only sound and touch to guide him, crawling from crater to crater, whispering "medic" just loud enough for wounded Americans to hear, but hopefully not loud enough to draw fire. The work was slow, terrifying, and utterly necessary. He found men who'd been lying in shell holes since the afternoon assault, too weak to crawl, too afraid to call out. Some were unconscious, some were delirious with pain and shock. All of them stared at him like he was a ghost when he appeared out of the darkness. The rope was gone, broken on the last descent, just as Doss had known it would. But he'd planned for this. Near the cliff edge, he'd found a section of Japanese communication wire, maybe 40 feet of it, lighter than the hemp rope but still strong. And he'd thought of something else. If he couldn't lower men down the cliff face, he could at least drag them to a different section of the ridge where the slope was gentler and stretcher-bearers could climb up to meet him. It meant longer journeys, more exposure, more time in the dark with every shadow potentially concealing an enemy soldier. It meant praying while moving became the only way to stay sane. Corporal Martinez was the one who finally saw what Doss was doing, really saw it, understood it in a way that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Martinez had made it down the cliff in the afternoon, one of the 19 who'd ridden that fraying rope to safety. Now he was standing in the staging area below the ridge, watching as stretcher-bearers climbed up the gentler slope and came back down with wounded men that Doss had somehow found and moved in complete darkness. "How is he doing this?" Martinez asked Captain Morrison. Morrison was silent for a long moment, watching another stretcher come down. "I don't think it's something we can explain," he said finally. "I think we just have to witness it." Up on the ridge, Doss had lost count. He knew there'd been the 19 on the rope and then Chen, and now however many more he'd dragged across the plateau to the pickup point. 30, 40. His mind wasn't tracking numbers anymore. It was tracking individual faces, individual pleas for help, individual moments of prayer between one wounded man and the next. "Thank you for my hands, even though they're bleeding. Thank you for my legs, even though they barely hold me. Help me find one more. Just one more." The central secret, the thing he would never fully explain to the officers who later wrote up his citation, the thing that didn't fit into the clean narrative of heroic medic saves dozens of men, was how close he came to breaking. Not physically, though his body was past any reasonable limit, but morally, spiritually. There was a moment, deep in the night, when he found a soldier who'd been hit by a mortar blast and was clearly dying. Nothing Doss could do would save him. The wound was too massive, the shock too severe. Medical doctrine said to mark him as expectant, beyond help, and move on to someone who had a chance. But the soldier was conscious, and he was terrified, and he grabbed Doss's hand and wouldn't let go. Doss stayed. For 20 minutes he held that hand and whispered prayers and promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "You're going home. You'll see your family. God is with you. You're not alone." And when the soldier finally died, Doss felt something crack inside himself, some belief that faith and action and prayer were always enough, that if he just kept moving and trusting, everyone could be saved. They couldn't. He couldn't save everyone. And the weight of that truth almost crushed him. He knelt in the mud beside the body, shaking, and asked God why. Why give him the strength to keep going if not everyone could be saved? Why answer some prayers with miraculous rope that held and others with death in the darkness? The answer, if it came at all, was gentle and terrible. You were never promised everyone. You were promised you could try for one more. Doss stood, stumbled, steadied himself, whispered the prayer one more time, just one more, and went back into the darkness. When Desmond Doss finally came down from Hacksaw Ridge, it was nearly dawn on the second day. 75 men had been evacuated through his efforts, a number that would later become famous, repeated in citations and documentaries and books. But Doss didn't know the count when he descended that last slope, supported by 2 soldiers who'd climbed up to physically carry him down because his legs had finally given out completely. He knew only that he'd run out of wounded to find and strength to find them with. The aid station was chaos. Captain Morrison had long since stopped trying to maintain normal triage procedures and had simply focused on keeping everyone alive long enough to get them to the field hospital. When Doss was carried in, Morrison took one look at him and immediately called for a stretcher. "I'm fine," Doss whispered. "Just tired. You have second-degree rope burns on both hands. Your knees are infected, you're severely dehydrated, and you've been awake for 36 hours straight," Morrison said. "You're going to the hospital." "But that's an order, Private." For once, Doss didn't argue. He let them put him on a stretcher, let them bandage his hands and give him water and morphine for the pain. But even as he drifted toward unconsciousness, he kept whispering the same prayer he'd been praying all night. "Thank you, Lord, thank you." The secret that emerged in the days after Hacksaw Ridge, the truth that complicated the clean, heroic narrative, was how the event broke something in Doss even as it built his legend. The company commander wanted to put him in for the Medal of Honor immediately. The men treated him with a reverence that made him deeply uncomfortable. Reporters, when they eventually found out, wanted to know how it felt to save 75 men. Doss couldn't explain that it felt like failing, because for every man he saved, he could remember 3 he'd found too late, or couldn't reach, or had to leave, marked as expectant in the darkness. The number 75 sounded like triumph. It felt like 75 fragments of other men's terror and pain that he'd absorbed into his own body and would carry forever. In the hospital, a chaplain came to visit him. The chaplain had heard the story, heard about the medic who prayed his way through an impossible rescue. He wanted to understand. "How did you keep going?" he asked. "How did you know you wouldn't break?" Doss looked at his bandaged hands. "I did break," he said quietly. "Somewhere in the middle of the night I broke. But breaking isn't the same as stopping." The chaplain leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I mean that faith doesn't make you unbreakable. It just means when you break, you keep moving anyway. You pray through the breaking, you let it happen, and you keep going, and you trust that God will hold the pieces together long enough to reach one more person." The words came slowly, painfully, like he was discovering them as he spoke. "Everyone thinks prayer is about strength," he continued, "about being strong enough to face what's coming. But that night on the ridge, I learned prayer is also about weakness. About being weak enough to admit you can't do it alone, that you need help with every breath and every step. The men out there, they believed prayer ends where bullets begin. But I think prayer begins where your own strength ends." The chaplain was quiet for a long moment. "The citation is going to say you saved 75 men through extraordinary courage and devotion to duty." "Yes." "Is that true?" Doss closed his eyes. "The number is true. The how is more complicated. I saved them because I was too stubborn to quit and too faithful to believe quitting was an option. I saved them because every time I thought I was done, I heard one more voice calling medic from the darkness. I saved them because prayer became the only rhythm my body understood anymore. Breathe in, whisper help, breathe out, move forward. Over and over until there was no one left to save." The big twist, the one that would haunt Doss for the rest of his life, was this. The legend of Hacksaw Ridge made him a symbol of faith under fire, proof that non-violent conviction could survive the most violent environment imaginable. But Doss knew the deeper truth. He hadn't survived because his faith was strong. He'd survived because his faith had learned to be weak. Weak enough to cry out for help with every prayer, weak enough to admit that he couldn't do any of it alone, weak enough to break and keep moving through the breaking. And that kind of weakness, that kind of dependence on something beyond himself, had proven stronger than any weapon. The Medal of Honor ceremony happened on October 12, 1945, 5 months after Hacksaw Ridge. President Truman placed the medal around Desmond Doss's neck and called him a real hero in front of cameras and officers and other recipients. Doss stood at attention, hands still scarred from the rope, and thought about all the men who weren't there. The ones who died in the craters, the ones he'd marked as expectant, the ones whose last words he still heard in his sleep. The citation was elegant and brief. He was a company aidman when the 1st Battalion assaulted a jagged escarpment 400 feet high. His name became a symbol throughout the 77th Infantry Division for outstanding gallantry far above and beyond the call of duty. What it didn't say, how many times he'd wept into the mud, how the smell of wet rope would make him nauseous for years, how he'd wake up sometimes convinced he could still hear men calling medic from the darkness and have to remind himself that the war was over, Okinawa was behind him, and there was no one left to save. The second big twist came slowly, over years and decades, as the legend of Hacksaw Ridge took on a life of its own. People wanted to know the secret. How did he do it? What was the trick? Was it technique or faith or some combination of supernatural intervention and personal courage? Doss never had a good answer. The truth was both simpler and more difficult than people wanted to hear. He'd survived by treating prayer not as a pause in action, but as action itself. By learning to whisper, "Help me," while crawling through fire. By accepting that faith didn't mean being fearless, it meant being terrified and moving anyway. By understanding that the question wasn't, "How do I become brave enough to do this?" but rather, "How do I keep praying while doing this?" In 1960, a young soldier came to visit him, sent by the army to interview veterans for a training film about combat medicine. The soldier had heard all the stories. He wanted to know if they were true. "Did you really save 75 men?" "Yes." "Were you afraid?" Doss paused. Outside his window, rain was falling, and he could hear it hitting the roof, could smell that wet earth smell that brought everything back. "Every second of every minute," he said finally. "But fear is just another thing to pray through." "And the rope? They say it should have broken." "It should have. It did, eventually." "So how—" "Prayer isn't magic," Doss interrupted gently. "It's not a force field that makes bullets miss or ropes unbreakable. Prayer it's the conversation you have with God when you're doing something impossible. It's how you keep your hands steady when they want to shake. It's the rhythm that carries you forward when your body wants to quit. Sometimes the rope holds, sometimes it breaks, but either way, you keep praying and keep moving." The young soldier looked confused, like he'd expected a clearer answer, something more definitive. Doss understood. The legend wanted certainty. The legend wanted to believe that enough faith made you invincible. But the memory knew different. The memory knew that faith made you vulnerable enough to keep trying when invincibility wasn't an option. Years later, after Doss had died and his story had been turned into movies and books and countless retellings, one truth remained constant. The men he'd saved on Hacksaw Ridge never forgot the soft sound of his voice in the darkness, the whispered prayers that came just before his hands reached them, the sense that this unarmed medic had somehow weaponized his weakness into something stronger than all their rifles combined. Corporal Martinez, who'd watched from below as stretcher after stretcher came down from the ridge, would tell his grandchildren, the miracle wasn't that he saved 75 men. The miracle was that he believed all the way down to his bones that prayer doesn't end where bullets begin, that faith doesn't pause for danger, that the most powerful thing a human being can do is keep moving toward the people who need help while whispering, "Lord, give me strength for one more." Adoomed, and maybe that was the real secret, the real answer to how an unarmed combat medic became a legend. Desmond Doss had learned that prayer is a form of movement, faith is a kind of momentum, and the strongest weapon in any war is the stubborn, terrified, utterly devoted conviction that you can reach just one more person before the darkness wins. They believed prayer ends where bullets begin. Desmond Doss proved, with 75 lives and a fraying rope and hands that never stopped shaking, that prayer begins exactly where bullets begin. And it doesn't stop moving until every last voice has been answered, every last hand has been held, every last brother has been brought home. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.